we are on borrowed time. I don't know how much longer the labor market can stay strong with interest rates at the level that they're at now and just the amount of pressure that most families are under to make ends meet.
Prices have you concerned? What part of the economy? Because we see some areas of worry in the household survey versus the establishment survey, which is where I started with her. They want to talk about a big payrolls number, but you see a lot of other evidence under the hood.
I mean, I think what I'm worried about most is just on some level, the dissatisfaction that Americans are expressing with their current economic situation, the amount of price increases that they've had to bear over the past 2.5 years, but at the same time, the lack of relief for any of those price increases. Policy geared towards making it easier for families to get by. I mean, none of that's allowed right now because we have to wait for prices to come down on their own through falling consumer demand. So that means we don't really get to help consumers at all. I don't know how much longer that can last.
Well, then you wake up on a morning like this and you hear that expectations of an interest rate cut have been pushed back and maybe nothing at all this year, even as President Biden predicts one. What do you make of that? Do you think it's true?
I mean, you have better people to forecast what the Fed will do than me. I prefer to look at the labor market than the people down the street. But, I do wonder, we know what needs to happen for the Fed to cut rates because they think inflation has cooled sufficiently, right? We have all the little ducks that have to come into a row and price. We get one kind of price report or one kind of jobs report. It either gets too bad in the labor market or we get good news from prices and then they're going to drop rates. And we are all waiting for that to happen have been for some time. I think what is not clear to me is when does the Fed admit that maybe this policy isn't going to do anything else? That we are at the limit of what it can accomplish. Even Dallas President Logan said it's not clear it's going to do anything else. Now, she was very careful to say that doesn't mean she thinks that rates should be cut. But, when you're living in a moment real time, you don't have the ability to step back and say, are interest rates the best thing that we can do or the only thing that we can do to move the economy from basically this what we think is a soft landing where we've been for 6 months.
Well, what do you do coming out of clearly still noise from a pandemic? How do you get to the supply side if that's where you're going?
I think that expansion of the labor market is good at keeping certain prices low because we don't have to have wages be bid up too quickly, and increasing labor supply is going to be challenging when the largest generation is retiring. And we're coming off of a period of restricted immigration. But at the same time, the U.S. has never pursued an active labor supply policy. It's not as if Congress has ever sat down and said, how do we maximize the number of workers in the United States today?
Well, there's a big argument about the impact of immigration. It's been going on for a long time. It gets louder with new research from Standard Charter that you may have seen. And the numbers were remarkable, if true, that undocumented migrants made up for half the job growth in this country since October, that we could be looking at as many as 100 to 109,000 jobs a month, distorting payrolls. Do you see that falling? First of all, do you believe that? And if you do you see that falling in the wake of this executive order from the president?
I hadn't seen it, but it doesn't necessarily surprise me. Immigration is a very big part of our labor market. Around 1 in 5 people who live in this country were not born here, and we tend to treat them as almost a separate segment that aren't as good or maybe aren't as important to labor market policy as native-born workers, but they are here and they are working, and to act as if they need a separate policy as opposed to are integrated into our labor market, is really putting a demographic imposition on something the labor market wouldn't make a distinction between.
Interesting. But if that is qualified here in the next couple of months, the Biden administration is acting to shrink the labor pool, you could say then, yes?
No and yes. I mean, because
indirectly,
the basis of the U.S. economy is that we have more people basically every month than we do the month before, and that the population is growing, and that the immigration is just a thumb on the scale, right? To change that growth be higher or faster, slower or faster. But no, I don't think it's necessarily good policy. I mean, similar to how I didn't think it was good policy to let child care subsidies expire when we knew that it was risking pushing more women out of the labor force. And we haven't seen that happen to the degree that it was predicted, but it's certainly not helping the U.S. workforce that child care costs families, on average, a quarter of their income.
Yeah. It's interesting. You remember this exchange between Elizabeth Warren and Jay Powell in one of their many standoffs in congressional hearings. We tune in just for these moments sometimes. And she was making the point that you keep hiking interest rates, you keep them higher for longer, you're going to destroy the job market. And he clapped back and said, what is better, to allow inflation to run out of control so families can afford nothing? What do you make of the balance that he's trying to find here?
All policies have trade-offs. That is the reality. There's never one winner of all we have to do is this and everything is okay and it doesn't have any consequences. There's always a trade-off to consider. And Powell's job is not to consider the trade-off for how Americans feel about economy and society, whether or not they think that their struggles are important to their government. And that is Warren's job, and that is elected officials' job. I mean,
well, it's also a Fed's job with a dual mandate, you could argue.
I mean, are they equal mandates?
Tell me.
I don't know. We have had unemployment below 4% for just over 2 years, ending this month, and that's the second time it's happened in almost 100 years. So it feels like maybe it's not quite equal of a mandate. I think there's a policy question that is very much, I write it down on a two-dimensional graph. Prices are going one way, the labor market is going one way, and here's my interest rate policy, and I just let it happen. But the world in which this takes place is a world in which families are struggling, and they hear news every day that corporations are not.